You can pause it.
Okay, yeah, pause it then. It were happening then and are happening now around the broad rubric of decolonization. And I will post you can follow us on social media, and we're always, looking for collaborations. So feel free to reach out to us. Today we have two brilliant scholars with us, who I'm very thankful to for taking out the time in the middle of a busy term, and who are going to so the first speaker that we have is Professor Meena Dhanda, who is a professor of philosophy and cultural politics at the University of Wolverhampton. And she led the research consortium on the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission on Caste in Britain in 2013 and 14, which remains one of the most influential documents. And she is the author of The Negotiation of Personal Identity and editor of Reservations for Women, both of which came out in 2008. Currently, she is supervising the EU Horizon 2020 project, Freedom from Caste, the Political Thought of Periyar Ramasamy. And today she is going to be analyzing the language of hurt and the articulations by privileged caste groups when they are confronted with the issue of caste in the diaspora. And our second speaker today is Dr. Karthick Manoharan, who is a Marie Curie Research Fellow also at the University of Wolverhampton, where he is working on the political thought of Periyar E.V. Ramasamy. And he is the author of Frantz Fanon, Identity and Resistance, and co-editor of Rethinking Social Justice. His recent publications include Freedom from God, Periyar and Religion. And today his talk is titled Ramasamy and Ramayana, Periyar and the Hindu Epic, where he will be discussing Periyar's approach and his subversive reading of the text. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Professor Dhanda to begin her talk. And also, just a little bit of the talk is going to be recorded, but the question and answer session will not be. So just to let you all know.
Okay, so thank you so much, Fatma. And thank you also, Jairaj, and the whole team at LSE for inviting us. I have been looking forward to it because I think it was sometime last semester that you had first asked and you weren't able to join then. And yeah, I hope that we make the best of the 90 minutes we have today. I believe I have about 30 minutes to talk first, followed by Karthik, and then the discussion. So please do keep your questions handy as and when. I don't know if you have a Q&A or alongside available or chat available, but whichever means you use, please do. Your questions are welcome, but please be polite. I am very, very afraid of aggravation because we are discussing a very difficult topic. So thank you so much. And so I'm going to, can everyone see my screen? The top of the screen, the first slide, Caste Under Covers. That is what I am going to speak on today very quickly. I will move on to my outline. So my outline is, I will give you a very brief context of the UK anti-discrimination legislation on caste, and then give you an example of a very unacademic attack on my academic inquiry, then the denials of caste in the UK, and the opposing stands on historical truth with respect to caste. I will introduce an idea of emergent vulnerability, which I think helps us understand what's happening. And then there's a little bit of philosophy in here as well, where I want to try to explain what it means to be a serial individual who is attempting to become a part of a collective group, and then give further an example of a particular kind of mediation, which I call the bystander effect. I'll follow that with an example of Hindus are in danger and Hindu ecosystem, which you have seen in the last week. Followed by another example of academic and cultural wars, which I should neatly lead to Karthik's talk on the Ramayana. And a very brief conclusion in the end with really no very big wise words, just a couple of questions. So here we go. So the UK context on anti-discrimination legislation is that the Equality Act 2010 had made caste a power, as in the ministers could add caste to the Equality Act. It was followed in 2013 by a development when, through discussions in Parliament, it was voted by MPs in Parliament that now it was a duty to add caste as an aspect of race in the Equality Act. Following that, our project, the Equality and Human Rights Commission project, which I led, was put on tender, and we got that opportunity. So I led a consortium of really very fine group of scholars from across UK, and we produced 2 reports, which were to inform the government how they should implement that duty. Then the government was supposed to do a public consultation on caste, which it did for a long time. It didn't do it. It finally did it in September, March to September 2017. And the response to that was extraordinary, about 16,000 responses, which were analyzed again by a government appointed team. And they decided that the existing statutory remedy, which is already there in the Equality Act, is sufficient and they need not add caste. So they are going to repeal the duty to add caste, which of course is a setback for those who were wanting to add caste to the Equality Act. So following that, the government had also announced that it will only repeal after it has given guidance to public bodies on how caste must be addressed. And that guidance, they prepared a draft, they had a consultation. We also participated in that in March 2019, but the guidance hasn't yet come, hasn't been publicly announced. Meanwhile, the background to that, against which all this happened, there were lots of public discussions going quite far back, actually, 2006, 2007, 9. You can find things on BBC television programs as well. In the course of our own project, we had a very, very wide public consultation, stakeholders workshop with 43 different organizations who sent their representatives. And in the same period, then shortly afterwards, there was a case going on of Miss Turkey, Turkey versus Chandok, which was of an Adivasi Christian woman who was employed by a couple who were ill-treating her, and the court found, the employment tribunal found that that was the case, and she was awarded 184,000 as a result of that judgment in her favor. After that judgment came, the government started saying, our law already takes care of caste discrimination. We don't need to add anymore. So that's what happened in the Turkey case. There are 2 sides, 3 actually. There are more sides. There are all party parliamentary groups, which are groups of MPs and peers in the House of Lords who constantly lobby the government. So there are APPGs for Hindus, for Dalits, for Sikhs and others. And they have been at the government for their own different perspectives. There have been community reports, there have been lots of blogs, lots of websites, also 2 documentaries. I was involved in at least 2 documentaries. One of them, the last one, which I would urge you could watch, is the BBC One documentary, Hindus, Do We Have a Caste Problem, which was first aired on the 13th of October and watched by over 1 million people. So here's the unacademic attack. These are just the references. I wrote an article in the Radical Philosophy, Anti-Casteism and Misplaced Nativism. Following that, Prakash Shah, who is a reader in law at Queen Mary, wrote a response, which wasn't published by Radical Philosophy because of the tone in which it was written. And I'll give you an indication of what that tone was in a second. So, but he published it on his own in indiafacts.org as a blog, which you can see. I've given you the reference here. So this is what he said. What you exemplify and suffer from is a form of colonial consciousness. You consider that you understand Western culture and how it is different from, say, Indian culture, although it appears that you have no access to either. So somehow, I don't know, maybe Prakash Shah has very privileged access. I know that he grew up in South Africa, in Africa, not here, not in UK or in India, but somehow he has access to both Indian and Western culture. I don't. I'm actually not going, I have never claimed that kind of access. I don't think any of us has any direct access. We construct it all the time. he says, instead, you imitate or mimic Orientalism and try to decorate its accounts without having access to the culture that produced Orientalism. You go on being an inauthentic imitator divorced from your own experience. Now, I don't know. I haven't actually been psychoanalyzed, and I haven't been on anybody's couch for anyone to tell me how divorced I am from my own experience. Maybe I'm a highly alienated being. I think many of us are alienated beings, and alienation per se is the result of the kind of world we live in, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But what follows from it, we'll see. So he goes on to say, why the shame of jati? And why is it only the shame of jati legitimate in your eyes? He says, you might couch your shame in claims about wanting revolution, but that too is a way of disguising your secret longing shaped by Semitic theology. Again, I don't know how Prakash Shah knows my secret longings, but there you are. He has interpreted from what I have written that I have some secret longings. He says, the shame betrays your colonial consciousness and it tells me that you know nothing of the Indian traditions. Okay, I shall not comment on that, what it tells him. If he can read from an essay that I have written, what I know or do not know about Indian traditions, he must have the third eye, I think, which I don't have. So here's what came in connection with around that time from another group of people completely working alongside Prakasha, who's one of the people who advises them. This is not my deduction. He's actually written about it. He's published overviews of the legislation, and he has said how he had tried to advise and where his advice was heard and where it wasn't heard, and so on. So this is Satish Sharma, who is the General Secretary of the National Council of Hindu Temples, UK, and he says, our scriptures and our recent history up until a few hundred years ago didn't have this caste system in there. This is being directed at us. This has been put around our necks. So he's saying we have nothing to do with caste. This is something which has come from outside. Again, quote, without even thinking about what it means, you automatically now gain the reaction, dirty Hindus, that we are terrible and have savage ideals. That's what's automatically invoked whenever you mention caste. Is not part of our culture and we don't want it introduced. So I find it really interesting that he is actually denying that that Hinduism can be associated with caste, which I think most people would agree is a bit of a strange position. But we learn as we read more that it's not about what people broadly understand by caste as in similarly as what they understand by varna or jati. It is something to do with the word caste. Uh, they would accept some kind of division in society which is linked to qualities, but they would want to say, A, they are not hierarchical, B, it's not caste. It's something else. So you want to call it varna, they might accept. So more recently, he said also, actually in the same interview, the BBC interview, he says, there has been this assumption that Hindus are castists, and I have recently heard what I think is an outrageous prejudicial term. But then he says, where groups who are not Dalits are now being referred to as caste supremacists. So one would want to ask, how would you even identify groups who are not Dalits? If you don't believe in and you don't have a sense and you don't think that caste is a part of, or caste divisions are a part of the caste world, I call it the caste world, how would you even identify, make a differentiation between groups who are Dalits and groups who are not? Clearly, he is making that distinction. So he must have some way of identifying people who are non-Dalits and who he believes are being wrongly characterized as caste supremacists. So his response to the government announcement that they were going to repeal the duty to add caste was very stark. He says that we still assert that the continuing use of the term caste with reference to the Hindu community is a perpetuation of the colonial use of this term to falsely denigrate and divide the Hindu community. And then he goes on to use the charge that they are being targeted by institutionally sanctioned hate speech. Now, so it's fascinating how the language of the left, the language of anti-racists, has been adopted to now turn it around and say that it is Hindus who are the target of hate speech. Whereas he is declaring that his intention is to dissolving caste consciousness entirely. I'm not sure how we can find evidence that there has been any action on that intention. What has NCHT UK done to dissolve caste consciousness? Apart from, of course, assuming that there isn't a caste consciousness. Okay, that's it. They assume there isn't. But what have they actually done to dissolve it? We have yet to see. Completely on the opposite side is Satpal Moomen, who's the chair of Caste Watch UK, who you have heard, I believe, in your group at recently a few days ago. So Satpal says, I do not understand why the Hindus want to oppose this call for equality. The only thing I can surmise from it is that they don't believe in equality. They want to perpetuate inequality. So I really don't understand their mindset on this. And further, he feels even more, he's calling to truth. Why the Hindus feel so victimized is beyond my imagination. They have to see the truth for what it is. You have to call a spade a spade. If you're unable to face the historical truth, then you will never be able to resolve the issue. And I think that's fair. That is a fair call that Satpal is making. Try to at least even admit facts for what they are. Now, I want to say it's easy. Maybe in the way I have read out these statements, you might think that I am making fun of it. I'm actually not giving any credence to the kind of charges that NCHT UK or Shah or others are making. But I want to pause for a minute and really try to understand what exactly is this hurt? Why is it that people do feel hurt? And so I want to use a philosopher that I really like, just as a um, what should I say, an epigram, someone I follow. So Wittgenstein says, don't play with what lies deep in another person. Wittgenstein is a German philosopher who says, don't play with what lies deep in another person. Now, what I want to say is, now, if you take it just as it is, it might appear that it is saying under no conditions can you ever criticize anybody. You can't say things which you know that people are sensitive about. But this don't play with what lies deep in another person works when, and in every other way, you are really respecting people. In an environment where people are being killed because they grow a mustache or they sit on a horse to go for a wedding or they marry outside caste, when that is happening, when your life and liberty to just do what you have a constitutional right to do is not being protected on the basis of caste, then this don't play with what lies deep doesn't even come into the operation yet. This is a highly evolved sense of a humanist respect for other people, which comes into the picture once you actually ensure the basic safety of life and liberty. So, whilst I really like this, I want to say this is where we are going. This is not something which we can use now and immediately say, oh, so I am hurt. So, why are you making a criticism of my tradition? I am hurt. Don't do this. No, I want to also see from every side with which I have a conversation, what are you doing to ensure that we actually first have the respect for basic life and liberty, which is being deprived from people in the name of caste. Now, whether or not anyone identifies with caste is your matter, interpretation of history or whatever you like. But what are you actually doing to ensure that conditions which are protecting life and liberty and people are not deprived of them on the basis of caste is ensured? Okay, then we can talk together. We can have a really good conversation about what are the limits of speech, what should be said, what can be criticized, what can't be criticized. Okay. But I want to understand where it's coming from. So there are all sorts of ways in which one can try and analyze what is this emergent vulnerability, where it's coming from. I think there is a real helplessness that people have as individuals. We are in between, a lot of our lives are robbed of individual agency. There's diminished individual agency of everyone across the board. And this helplessness is coming from a lot of causes, but we have to find something to scapegoat. We have to find people who we can directly blame for having created our lack of agency. And then secondly, alongside this diminished lack of agency, I would say now that particularly now when we see that everything is mediated through this other world, the online world, and the particular circumstance now in which we are really isolated from each other in some ways, where everything has to be mediated, our individual agency is very diminished. Wherever there isn't a group which can provide us the security we need to carry forward our projects, we are looking for these groups. This is the condition in which I think that the vulnerability of people who follow the Hindu hotline comes from. Okay, so a little bit more. I'll push that a little bit more. Tell me if it's going beyond what is okay, is possible to discuss. I'm holding it like a philosophy class now. Okay, so the next step I want to take is that these identities, what you call identities, that I am a Hindu or I am of a particular caste group or whatever, or even that I'm a man or a woman, these are what Joko Sath, another philosopher that I follow on this in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, describes as a serial individual. You are a part of a series. You are a part of a passive collective. You just find yourself in this condition with which you actually have many possible positions you can take. You're positioned variously in this collective. So as a woman, I'm of a particular class, region, etc. There are many possible positions I have, but the conditions in which I find myself, they face me as a necessity with which I have to do something. Okay, so when suddenly in the street somebody calls me, teases me or something, I'm made to aware of the fact that I'm a woman. I may not be walking around as a woman or thinking of myself as a woman, but this is a necessity I have to immediately deal with when I am, this passive fact of my being a woman confronts me. I have to do something. So these are the collectivities in which we find ourselves, but the unity, so my unity with other women is not really of common characteristics. It is only of the common positions I can hold. So if I, along with other women, are responding to us being attacked, we are immediately together in this. It is in this sense that we can see that those who are presenting themselves, the examples I gave before, they present themselves as the victim of colonialism or as the targets of hate speech. This is like a serial collective. But what's really interesting is that they are being formed as a group. Okay, this is when they are being formed around a project. And this project is a response to this serial condition where people are individuals, interchangeable, themselves each being not very significant. Each can be substituted by another in a series, but they're being formed into a group. And that project making is to congeal expectations around one type of position. Yeah. And what's important in that position is that they have to assume the status of custodians of an authentic tradition. They are taking then a moral high ground. Okay, the last another concept I want to add to this, which I confess haven't really worked out very well, but I'm working on it, is that all of this is mediated through what I would like to call the bystander effect. So particularly in the UK now, when we're talking about caste discrimination has to move out of the dyad of oppressor and oppressed. There are actually at least three factors. They're the oppressor, they are the oppressed, and they are the spectators. And it's the spectators who are not a part of the caste world who are then turned into adjudicators. They have to take sides. They have to decide what to do. And because then they take the view of being ignorant, they're clueless, they don't know what's what. And unless someone is proven guilty of having, uh, you know, uh, done discrimination, they want to take the view that they are innocent. So caste prejudice, unless it can be proved, it's a catch-22 situation for those who are victims. The bystander doesn't understand. The bystander doesn't know, cannot make independent judgments of what is happening. And this is the position which we find ourselves if there is no law on caste in the UK. Okay, reliance on case law is there, but it's not going to be. I've written about this with Annapurna actually, how it's not very reliable, even though we actually assisted in Ms. Turkey's case to help her win the case, but still it is not the reliable uh, board. So now I'm going to give you the example, which you would have come across in the last few days, of how all this plays out. You know, the formation into a group, and then the bystander effect as well. So you would have seen this in the last few days. Uh, there, there was a group which is discovered. Megnath S. and Shambhavi Thakur have written about it. Hate Factory inside Kapil Mishra's Hindu ecosystem in News Laundry last week. And most of the people there are upper caste Hindu men. Now, there was a program then Alpha Khanum did following that, in which they discussed this Hindu ecosystem, which is a Telegram group, which News Laundry infiltrated, if you like. And the group is formed around, to form the group, you have to answer questions. And one of the set of questions is any special area of interest. What are the special area of interest? Gaur Raksha, Gaur Seva, fight, love jihad, ghar vapsi, halal, Hindu ekta, mandir nirmal, Hindu ekta, and seva in general. These are the themes around which the project is formed, in which people's commitment is being sought. So a group is being formed. So there are people who have all kinds of issues, you know, with what's going wrong and how they are hard done by, but their expectation is going to be congealed around very specific things, not a reinterpretation of history or whatever, but very specific things. And actually also action following from that is also going to be very specific. They give examples of how that, and of course Khanum says that there is no truth, only fake news in all of this. So this idea of the Hindu ecosystem, the top 15, and they have 15 selected topics of relevance to us are 2 or 3. So first is Sanatan Dharam, beyond the geographical boundary of India. That's the idea of this Hindu ecosystem. Now you might say, isn't it ironical that when Greta and other, you know, Rihanna spoke, you know, they were told not to interfere. Whereas this worldview, the Hindu ecosystem itself, is clearly announcing that it is beyond the geographical boundary of India. Okay. The 11th and the 12th point are also really interesting, in which the point is made that there is a killing of Hindus happening. So the term used is Hindu Holocaust. And finally, that there are wrong teachings in schools, school college books, academic and cultural invasion. Now, this is where we come to the next talk that we will do shortly. So we are looking now at academic and cultural wars. And I want to remind you of the example from the past, where A.K. Ramanujan, who's a highly respected scholar of Indian literature, a folklorist, translator, poet, playwright, he wrote this essay, which was to become the center of a controversy in Delhi University. So the essay was 300 Ramayans, 5 examples, and 3 thoughts on translation. And what happened? Of course. So here's this example of her. The ABVP, the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, which is the student wing of the ruling party BJP, they claimed that the essay hurt the sentiments of the Hindu community and therefore should be withdrawn. And in fact, the Academic Council of Delhi University put it to vote, and 19 favor, 10 against decided to remove the essay from the syllabus. This is what happened. Simply to discuss an essay that there are 300 different versions of Ramayana was not possible. But we have the other side as well. They can be hurt on the other side. So here's Digvi Prasad Chauhan, who is the leader of Dalit Mukti Morcha. And he says, we need to break such shackles of slavery that killed our ancestors, where the killers are worshipped. He's talking about all the festivals, you know, Diwali and so the Shera and all of these festivals, Holi. All those who were killed, may it be Eklavya, Mahisasura, Ravan, Shambhuk, Bali, Holika are our devtas. And such moves need to have a complete stop for all times. Mool Nivasis, indigenous people, have to be affirmative about what their true history is. So he is also calling for, on the basis of herd, okay, why are you celebrating the killing of our gods? Now, if you put it to whose history, whose tradition, whose culture is going to be owned as our? And should we or should we not have the freedom to celebrate the gods we want to, even if some of those gods were killers of other gods who are dear to other people? So these are difficult questions. You have to think that the idea that as if there is some one common Hindu herd is just unbelievable. We know that arising from within this so-called wide Hindu world, including people like Digri Prasad Chauhan, who this group of Hindus who want the global worldview also want to include. We know that the attempt is made to include everybody who is a non-Muslim, who is a non-Christian in this Hindu world. But then, what are you going to do about the hurt of these people whose gods are not celebrated, in fact, whose killing is celebrated by the majority of Hindus? So I'll end quickly with just my brief conclusion is that we really need to have a bit more theoretical engagement on how these cries of hurt and danger are actually connected to the rise of spontaneous violence, which I mentioned before, that only if we can ascertain that there are conditions for the protection of the life and liberty of people who are being attacked on the basis of caste, then we can really start listening. We need to connect these two things. I think we need to form, if I'm right about the fact that it is our serial identity, our being a part of series, parts of series as individuals, not having any group identity, which is also a problem. Then we have to think about how can we form creatively groups which will give an anchor to what people want to be, how they want to really express themselves, how they really want to develop. And finally, which is just a very old call, that we really have to defend academic inquiry. There is, I find that the attacks that came on me and by people telling me, of course, that's personal. Maybe this person is just not generous enough to accept different points of view. But I really am interested in understanding the point of view of the Hindu art. But I think an academic inquiry is only possible if we don't start calling names, and we don't start accusing each other of this or that kind of consciousness, which we have. No one has any access to. I don't know how anybody else has. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and I will ask, of course, invite Karthik. I'm sure you will. I'm going to stop screen sharing now.
Oh, shall I proceed? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Meena Dhanda, for setting the stage and for uh, creating the mood for which in which I can make my presentation. And thank you to Jairaj Sundaresan for inviting me to speak here. And thank you so much, Fatma, for your very kind words of introduction. So without any further ado, let me just jump into the presentation. But before that, a necessary disclaimer. Some of the controversial views which I'm going to say are of Periyar's and not mine. So whatever anger you have, take it out on Periyar, not on me. Okay. Anyway, so let me start. Okay, so the Ramayana let me just give a sort of a very brief sort of an overview of this text. It's one of the most, if not the most widely known, respected and revered literary text in India. It would not be an exaggeration to say that most Indians, irrespective of perhaps even religious background, know the basic storyline of the Ramayana. One of the two oldest and celebrated epics in India, the other being the Mahabharata, its story might have begun in 750 BCE, but its textual form, which is attributed to Valmiki, was composed somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. Now, it has been argued that Valmiki's Ramayana was post-Buddhist. Suvira Jaiswal makes this argument, and was actually composed as a challenge to Buddhism, and that it was its dramatic saga that made it immensely popular across wide sections of the population. Now, there are many who believe, not without legitimacy, that the Ramayana is as foundational to the pan-Indian literary cultural imagination as Homer's Iliad is to the West. Others say that Ramayana is probably more influential. Indeed, while the Iliad is still passionately read across the world, it is not a text that informs the political imagination of any political party or any movement anywhere, at least to the best of my knowledge. Nor do you see people taking political and social action in the name of Achilles, Diomedes, or Hector, or opposing them. On the other hand, Ramayana and its central characters, Rama, Lakshmana, Sita, Hanuman, and Ravana, continue till this day to inspire political discourse and action in India. Now, you are, of course, familiar with how Mahatma Gandhi imagined Ramraj as a peaceful, harmonious utopia. At the other extreme, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, led by the Hindu nationalists, which claimed Ayodhya as the birthplace of Rama, led to the destruction of the Babri Masjid, which was probably a key moment in post-independent Indian politics that marked the ascendancy of the Hindu right. Concurrently, Rama was projected by the Hindu nationalists as a sort of a pan-Indian national figure. And as recent as 2020, a massive ceremony was held in Ayodhya to lay the foundation of the Ram temple, presided over by the Indian Prime Minister himself. To the Hindu nationalists, Rama's presence is not just religious, it is historical and very political. Valmiki's Ramayana is mostly projected by the Hindu nationalists as a sort of an uber text, though one may also doubt if they engage with its historicity, themes, and literary aesthetics seriously at all. But however, there are also contesting narratives and readings of the Ramayana. In narratives of mainstream Hinduism, which is now being advocated as the singular narrative, Rama is seen as the ideal ruler and a most exemplary being, the Maryada Purushottam. Sita is seen as the ideal wife, whose name is synonymous with purity and chastity. Lakshmana is seen as the ideal brother, and Hanuman as the ideal devotee. Now, these characters have also been popularized by cinema, teleseries, and cartoons. Ravana, on the other hand, is reviled as evil and despicable, though Valmiki's text itself gives a more ambiguous flavor. The Hindu festival of Dashera, which is immensely popular even today, culminates with the burning of the effigy of Ravana. In the Tamil country, the traditional telling of Ramayana was most popularly influenced by the early medieval Tamil poet Kamban, who composed his Iramavadaram for a Chola king, for a Tamil Chola king. Likewise, several Tamil kings who followed identified themselves with Lord Rama. Now, Suvira Jaiswal identifies a feature common to most Ramayana literature, namely, and I quote her, God is universally accessible and grants salvation to all those who worship him with devotion, but he does not allow violation of caste rules and disrespect to Brahmanas regardless of their qualification. For instance, the much later Ramacharitra of Tulasidas talks of the natural superiority of the Brahmins and the innate inferiority of Sudras and women. And this, of course, brought about counter reactions in later times. Now, these other counter reactions may surprise and even disrupt the mainstream readings of the Ramayana. To go back to a point which Professor Dhanda raised, Ramanujam's celebrated essay, 300 Ramayanas, where he discusses 5 different Ramayanas, created such a furor that it had to be revoked from Delhi University. Now, in this essay, Ramanujam merely wanted to explore how these hundreds of tellings of a story in different cultures, languages, and religious traditions relate to each other, what gets translated, transplanted, transposed, right? But even this acceptance of the diversity of this tradition was unacceptable for the Hindu nationalists. Now let's just have a look at some of these stories. For instance, in the Jaina telling of the Rama story in the Paumacharyam, the ascetic Gautama sees Ravana as a great Jaina king. And in this version, Lakshmana kills Ravana while Rama becomes disgusted with worldly violence and becomes a Jain monk. In one Buddhist Jataka version, Sita is actually the sister of Rama. Now, Ambedkar refers to this in riddles in Hinduism as well. In the Adbhuta Ramayana of Kashmir, Rama is defeated by Ravana, and it is Sita who fights the war and wins it. Right? Now, there are these sort of different tellings of the Ramayana much earlier in history itself. Right? Likewise, subaltern communities have also adapted Rama's story in their own narratives. Now, in the oral traditions of the Ramayana of the Kurumba tribe of South India, a much greater prominence is given to Hanuman, who is seen as a sort of a proto-tribal, and likewise the local Tamil Pandyan king plays a very crucial role in the story. So these sort of traditions have been there regarding the Ramayana, right? Yeah, just a second. What happened to my paper? Oh, just give me a minute. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So now when we move on to the 19th century, right, there were counter narratives in other parts of colonial India which evoked the villains of the Ramayana. In the Asuras or the Rakshasas, they were invoked positively to challenge the mainstream narratives of the Ramayana. For instance, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, his epic poem Meghnad Bad, which is a key work of modern Bengali literature, glorified Ravana's son Indrajit and viewed Lakshmana's killing of him as a cowardly act. A prominent counter-narrative from the subaltern communities was Jyotirao Phule's own reading of the Asura king Mahabali. This is a different story, of course, where he views the Vaishnava heroes, including Vamana, Parashurama, and Rama, as those who used deceit, treachery, and violence to defeat indigenous, subaltern, and egalitarian leaders and kings. To Jyotirao Phule, the Aryans were invaders from Iran, and the Avatara myths were actually accounts of their conflicts with native kings, who were later demonized as Rakshasas and Asuras. Right? Now, as far as when we go further down south, it was not only secular rationalists, but even non-Brahmin Saivite thinkers of the 19th century who saw the Asuras or the Rakshasas as egalitarian natives of India. Now, they saw Ravana as a sort of a primordial Dravidian person who was lauded as egalitarian, casteless, exemplary in moral terms, and a democrat, while Rama was seen as the anti-democratic oppressor. David Shulman records this. In 1880, Somasundara Nayakar, an important Saivite leader, read the Ramayana as a history of the Vaishnavite subjugation of the indigenous Saivites. Sundaram Pillai, another important Saivite leader, attacked the Ramayana, and he propagated the idea that the Ramayana was written to belittle Dravidian culture and to eulogize Aryan penetration and dominance in South India. The influential Neo-Saivite thinker Maraimalai Adigal also criticized the Ramayana, including the Kamba Ramayana, for distorting reality and fooling the masses. Now, the Dravidian self-respecters who came later, who often called for a total rejection of anything to do with Hinduism, and the Tamil Saivites, who saw the Saiva religion in Tamil Nadu as being autonomous with egalitarian possibilities, they often clashed with each other several times. But they held common stage on a few occasions, mainly to oppose Hindi imposition and also to oppose the Ramayana. To them, there was no difference between the two, right? Because both the Tamil Saivites and the Tamil self-respecters saw the Ramayana as providing the ideological justification for North Indian hegemony over South India and Aryan hegemony over the Dravidian country. Right? The social critics of this period identified the creatures called the Rakshasas in the Ramayana with the indigenous inhabitants of the south, whom they classified as Dravidians, and they glorified Ravana. Now, before I proceed to Periyar's approach directly, it is worth to note over here that Periyar's critique of Ramayana, just like Phule's invoking of the Mahabali myth, was not based on an objective reading of the epic and of the myth of the Ramayana, but on a deliberately subversive reading. Now, research by scholars like the eminent archaeologist H.D. Sankalia posits that the Lanka of Valmiki's Ramayana was not the country we know as Sri Lanka today, but in all probability was a reference to a locality in eastern India. Likewise, Valmiki's Ramayana was not a Tamil king, and it is not only subaltern communities, but also there is a community called the Kanyakubja Brahmins in Madhya Pradesh who lay claim to him, and they claim Ravana to be their ancestor. On the other hand, the ancient Tamils were very familiar with the Rama myth. Now, the Purana Nuru, which is a Sangamera anthology of poetry, refers to Ravana as an Arakan or a demon, evil demon. Now, the story of Rama was contrary to what Periyar and the Dravidianists and the Tamil Saivites say. I don't think that was an imposition on the ancient Tamils, but it was adapted and modified over the times. Because it's important to note over here that in Kamban's version of the Ramayana, both Rama and Ravana were pure Tamil speakers. Now, to just narrate an incident from Kamban's Ramayana, when Ravana's sister Surpanaga proposes marriage to Rama, Rama rebuffs her saying that, and I quote, "What you ask is against the traditions of caste. You are a Brahmin and I a Kshatriya." Right? Now, Surpanaga replies that her father is a Vedic Brahmin, but her mother is the daughter of a spearman. Now, the assumption that the Ramayana portrays Ravana as an explicit lower caste and therefore a villain is not fully accurate. But then again, the element of ambiguity of Ravana's caste and his opposition to a hero who assertively stood by a Varna order allowed the appropriation of Ravana by Dravidianists and other pro-indigenous groups across India. Now, Periyar's reading of the Ramayana was not actually based on a fidelity to the original text or on any aesthetic concerns, but was informed completely by his anti-hegemonic politics, specifically his opposition to the collusion of religion and state, which is the Brahminical political theology. Periyar mercilessly lampooned Hindu scriptures and myths in his speeches and articles. In the newspapers he edited, most notably Kudiyarasa and Vidudalai, routinely carried satires and caricatures about Hindu gods. The Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva and their avatars, and other smaller but popular gods like Indra, Ganesha, and Kartikeya, found themselves to be the objects of critical ridicule. Besides seeking to show that the stories of these gods were fanciful and irrational, Periyar and his followers also sought to portray them as upholders of a Brahminical caste order. And of all the major Hindu texts, 3 were given special attention by Periyar: the Manusmriti, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Ramayana. A key reason being, and I quote M.S.S. Pandian over here, all 3 texts attempted to transcend sectarian affiliations among Hindus and presented a unified Hinduism. Now, it is worthy to note over here again that no less a person than Mahatma Gandhi placed the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Gita at the core of not just his religious, but even his secular imagination, the Indian nationalist imagination. While more conservative Hindu leaders saw the Manusmriti and its rigid code as a guidebook for an ideal social order. Ambedkar, of course, as you would know, launched a rigorous and critical attack on these texts, especially the Manusmriti and Bhagavad Gita. And likewise, his work also greatly complemented Periyar's own critique of Hinduism. Among other things, Ambedkar shared with Periyar an oppositional critique of the Hindu epics. Now, as far as the Ramayana itself was concerned, to Ambedkar, Rama was not an ideal ruler, and he criticizes Rama's killing of Vali to help Sugriva and the killing of Shambhuka, a Sudra engaged in ascetic exercises, in order to placate a Brahmin. Now, Ambedkar makes this observation in his Riddles of Hinduism. Both the Vali and Shambhuka incidents are also often referred to by Periyar to indict Rama as an unjust being. Likewise, several subaltern writers and poets in the South have also used Shambhuka's story to challenge Brahminical narratives. Now, Periyar gained most notoriety in his life for his radical rereading of the Ramayana and his inversion of the Asura Ravana as a lower caste hero. That, of course, Ramanujam, A.K. Ramanujam, Paula Richmond, and Sheldon Pollock have also recorded several other diverse, non-canonical, and transgressive readings of Ramayana. And perhaps we should see Periyar's reading as just one among the several transgressive readings of the Ramayana, and nothing to be taken offense over, right? Now, as far as the 20th century Tamil Nadu is concerned, Paula Richmond notes that the proponents of a separate Tamil state identified with Ravana, and Periyar read Ravana in this political context as a paragon of South Indian virtue. Ramraj, literally the rule of Ram, was seen by prominent Hindu leaders as an ideal state characterized by perfect justice, order, and stability. Now, Ramraj has been invoked by both literal and metaphorical readings of the Ramayana and has been used by Hindu liberals and conservative alike as a past utopia that serves as a model for a future nation-state ideal. C. Rajagopalachari, a prominent, more commonly known as Rajaji, a prominent Congress leader from Tamil Nadu, thought that the newly independent Republic of India should strive to recreate Ramraj. Rajaji, a contemporary of Periyar, also published popular retellings of the Ramayana in both Tamil and English, which continue to have good sales in the market even today. In Tamil Nadu's politics, especially with regards to religion, he and Periyar were seen to be in opposite camps, even though they were very good friends in personal life. They would often contest each other very sharply on each other's religious views. Periyar for Rajaji's support of Rama, and Rajaji for Periyar's support of Ravana. And after doing that in the morning and evening, they would go to each other's home and share a cup of tea. I'm not sure if we can have that sort of civil debate in these times, but anyway, right? Now, the Times of India, in an article called "The Long-Standing Disagreement Between Periyar and Rajaji as a Battle for Religion," with Periyar representing the iconoclast, relentlessly preaching godlessness, and Rajaji representing God-fearing people, urging with great zeal the need for piety and faith, right? In September 1954, Periyar said in a speech that the relentless attacks on Ramayana was winning over even the Brahmins to his cause, and therefore Rajaji was being desperate to defend the Ramayana. Now, one could be excused for thinking that Rajaji represented the Devas and Periyar represented the Asuras. Now, Periyar vocally challenged the projection of Ramraj as an ideal state. To Periyar, Ramraj was symbolic of the supremacy of Brahmanism against the interests of the lower caste, of North Indian Aryans over the South Indian Dravidians, of patriarchy over women's liberation, of hierarchy over equality. I quote Periyar here: "Isn't Ramraj a rule of Varnashrama? Can anyone say that people would have equal liberties in Ramraj?" Now, Periyar alleged that Ramraj involved the enforcing of caste differences and violence against women. Paula Richmond argues that to Periyar, Ramraj was a pernicious Brahminic fiction designed to keep non-Brahmins from challenging the status quo. Challenging liberal and conservative Hindu leaders alike, Periyar read the Ramayana as a fictionalized account of the Aryan attack upon and the subjugation of the Dravidians, and he sought to demythologize and discredit this epic. Venkatajalapati complements this reading and argues that the core argument of Periyar was that Ramayana was a text that narrated the defeat by deceit and stealth of the Dravidians by the Aryans. Now, one could definitely ask, why should Periyar spend so much time over Ramayana and its concepts in such depth if he did not believe in it, right? Now, Periyar argued that Ramayana, both Valmiki's Sanskrit version and Kamban's Tamil version, continued to have a corrosive moral and social influence among the Tamils of his time. And hence, it was a task of the rationalists to expose the true nature of these texts, right? In Periyar's view, Ramaraj was not something which happened in the past, right? It's not just representing a past Aryan Hindu dystopia, but it was an imposition of that ideal and a perpetuation of the ideal at the present that would contribute to the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Both God and the state were seen by Periyar as impediments to his project of creating rational, casteless, and liberated individuals. And in his struggle, Periyar enlisted the Asura Ravana as an ally. Referring to the Valmiki Ramayana, Periyar praises the good qualities of Ravana, such as courage, heroism, and strength, and knowledge and benevolence. And he uses the same text, Valmiki's Ramayana, to highlight the negative qualities of Rama. Now, Periyar infers from his reading of the Ramayana that Ravana opposed the Devas and the priests because they conducted sacrifice of living creatures. He argues that Ravana conducted his governance in a highly civilized manner, while his sister Surpanaga was insulted and mutilated by Rama and Lakshmana. He did not resort to violent behavior against Sita, even though she was under his power. Periyar also further fancifully alleges that Sita wanted to elope with Ravana. Now, again, let me remind here that these are his opinions, not my opinions. Right? Now, Volga, who is a very prominent Telugu feminist writer, who herself is the author of a critical retelling of the Ramayana from Sita's vantage point, actually records similar perspectives from her predecessors. She notes that Chalam, who's a highly acclaimed rationalist Telugu writer, Chalam presented Sita as someone who saw Ravana's love for her to be more sincere than that of Rama. That was Chalam, not me. Right? Chalam was also a rationalist and a contemporary of Periyar, and one may speculate if he was informed by the latter's critique of the Ramayana. Now, when Periyar read the Ramayana, we must acknowledge that he selectively highlighted and even exaggerated the virtues of Ravana and argued that since Ravana and his group were the enemies of the Brahmins, they were shown as brutes and monsters. Now, Periyar had a very unique sense of satire, and in one text he actually says, after enumerating the virtues of Ravana and the faults of Rama, relying on the same sources, Periyar says, and I quote him, "Since the Brahmins have depicted the incarnation of God in such an irresponsible manner, we must wonder what glory is there to being God or an avatar of God." In other words, he's taking a satirical dig at the Brahmins for portraying Rama in a sort of not a particularly great light. Okay, so Periyar over here, he is not actually reading this literally, but hyper literally, right? He did not want to read epics like the Ramayana for their literary value, and instead sought to attack them for what he saw were their social and political consequences. He did not see moral qualities in the Ramayana, and he argued that the mere ancientness of a scripture was not proof of its greatness, but of its irrelevance. Now, in a speech in 1963, he asked, and I quote, Shouldn't our scholars expose the limitations, crimes, foulness, and vulgarity in these epics? Shouldn't they inform the Tamils and the Southerners that the Ramayana was composed to degrade them? End quote. Periyar, in fact, did not even spare the DMK for building statues for Kamban. You know, Kamban is seen by many Tamils to be a very important literary figure in Tamil history. And undoubtedly, Iramavadaram is a brilliant piece of literature. All said and done, Periyar believed that Kamban's work was inimical to social egalitarianism, and therefore, to him, its literary merit alone could not be considered positively. Periyar confessed, and I quote, "Since I work for social progress, not only do I have no affinity for God, religion, and caste, I also have none for language and literature." Periyar had a very strong anti-aesthetic streak, and he did not find anything great about classical literature or poetry. Both Valmiki's and Kamban's Ramayana are remarkable works of world literature, comparable with Homer and Virgil. But apart from being merely literary texts, the Ramayana also informed social and political morality in India, including ideal notions on the state, the ruler, the ruled, social classes, gender roles, and rights and duties in society. The historian Upinder Singh notes how crucial Ramayana and Mahabharata were in informing the notions of dharma and kingship. I quote her, "They are dramatic stories, powerful purveyors of religious ideas and social values, and highly influential political texts." Now, not only monarchs of ancient and medieval times, but conservatives and moderate Indian Hindu nationalists who were Periyar's predecessors or contemporaries also held the Ramayana as a supremely moral and a political text. Gandhi, Rajaji, Golwalkar were all of different political persuasions, and it would definitely not be right to place them on the same level. But all said, they all saw in the Ramayana not just a pure literary text, but a guide to political morality. Thus, it became imperative for counter-hegemonic voices like Ambedkar and Periyar to question religious epics like these through a political critique. Periyar's anti-aestheticism must be read in this context. To him, the political concerns of the present and the future were pressing enough to reject a purely aesthetic approach to literature, and he sought to demystify the values informing social and political morality in these epics. Now, where Michael Madhusudan Dutt presented an emotionally moving and highly aesthetic account of the Asura Indrajit in Meghnad Badh, in contrast, Periyar's account of Ravana was deprived of aesthetics and sharply political. Now, I'll just give a few more quotes of Periyar. You know, he says, you know, the Ramayana was written mainly to destroy our people who stood in opposition to the Aryans. How can we celebrate this as a holy text, right? In a speech in 1966, he says, and I quote him, "Ramayana means the law of Manu. Opposition to Ramayana means the ethic of equality." Now, Periyar adds that the morals espoused in the Ramayana permit the upper caste to commit whatever crimes they want in order to protect their privileges, right? Periyar, what he does over here is to engage in a blend of literal and metaphorical reading with respect to such texts. In Valmiki's Ramayana, as I said, both Rama and Ravana are North Indian kings, whereas in Kamban's Ramayana, both of them are implied to be Tamil-speaking kings, right? While Rama in both these texts is shown to uphold the Brahminical order, neither Kamban's Ramayana nor Valmiki's Ramayana suggest that Ravana stood for an anti-caste egalitarianism. But the appropriation of Ravana as an anti-caste figure were not objective but subversive readings of these texts. Periyar pursues a sort of a subversive strategy where he sees Ravana as a figure that resisted divinely inspired tyranny. Periyar's defense of Ravana should not be seen as his belief in the historical presence of this mythological character. He strategically appropriates Ravana to counterpose a Dravidian icon against what he saw as an Aryan icon. which he associated with the unjust exercise of high caste social and political power. Ravana, the noble Asura, to Periyar, was a useful accessory from mythological sources to counter the hegemonic claims of the Hindu god and the Hindu state. Nothing more. Do I have 2 more minutes or?
Sure, Karthik, go ahead.
Good? Okay. Okay. So this is just a conclusion, a very short conclusion and something open for reflection and further conversation. Because atheists, as you would know, in these times are in a very precarious state, especially in states where religion and politics overlap. Right? Now, one can hear of routine assassinations of atheist writers in Bangladesh, while India was shocked by the killings of the rationalist thinkers like Narendra Dabolkar, M.M. Kalburgi, Govind Pansare, and Gauri Lankesh by Hindu extremists, allegedly. Now, when these killings happened in India, a lesser-known killing also happened, which was the murder of Muhammad Farooq in 2017. Now, Muhammad Farooq was a Periyarist activist associated with the Dravidar Vidudalai Kazhagam, and he was killed allegedly by Islamists who were offended by his critical opinions on religion. Let me just take a very quick digression over here. Sabah Mahmood, professor, she claims that, any sort of critical remarks or critical statements on Prophet Muhammad might cause moral injury to the Muslims, since the Prophet is not just a historical figure and a founder of the religion, but also because he's a moral exemplar and an object of veneration. A counterpoint has been made by Hindu nationalists and devout Hindus. Could devout Vaishnavite Hindus argue that they also suffer moral injury when they encounter criticisms, cartoons, or radically different opinions about Lord Rama, who to them is the Maryada Purushottam, an exceptional being worthy of the highest respect? Couldn't such injured Hindus call for a ban on the writings of Phule, Ambedkar, and Periyar, where their favorite deities are being explicitly criticized? In 2018, some such morally injured Hindus threatened a female journalist with exactly a Charlie Hebdo style attack over her cartoons of Rama, which they found to be offensive and hurtful to their sentiments. Fortunately, we are at a stage where they have not taken such action yet, but in the future, no one knows, right? I somewhere think that our sentiments can't avoid being hurt, right? I mean, just to give a sort of a personal example, recently I was reading something of an interview of Jean-Luc Godard, and he makes us remark that Akira Kurosawa is an overrated filmmaker. Now, Kurosawa to me is something like God, and I got very offended by the statement, and my sentiments were gravely injured. From then, I decided that I will not watch any films of Godard anymore, right? But I wouldn't take any sort of violent action, nor would I pursue a path of violence to convey my objections. Is this perhaps a path we could take, where we agree that our sentiments are likely to get injured in public debate, in intellectual conversations, but also try to give a civil enough response, even if we should feel moral injury and hurt? These are just questions for reflection. I'm still struggling with them. I have no definite answers, but I'm open to debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Meena and Karthik. I'm taking over from Fatma to organize the Q&A. My name is Jairaj Sundareshan. I teach at the Department of Geography and Environment in LSE. And I volunteer with the Decolonizing Collective. So we have about 20 minutes. Maybe we are very happy to be flexible with the time. Depends on the speakers and others participants and the seriousness of the questions that you have and so on and so forth. So the floor is open for questions. Please firstly say who you are, where you're from, and please ask the question. And please, as Professor Meena Dhanda said at the beginning, please, these are very difficult questions and conversations that could ensue from these these talks, and so please be very respectful. And